Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real honour and a great privilege to be here speaking to everyone today. I personally feel somewhat overwhelmed by the response and the quality of the debate and the fact that it really teaches us so much how globally connected we are in this ever-changing world. This beautiful view we have of Belfast Lough. I come from a shipping background, and if my old boss was here, he would be sitting at the window waiting to see the next ship that was coming up and wondering, was it into our agency? But, you know, it's wonderful, and the people that we have here today, the people from academia, we have Bronagh Hinds. From the trade union movement, we have Patricia McKeown, and I have to say the trade union movement have been maybe the unstated heroes of serious peace work throughout the whole process. They have been wonderful, they have been neutral, and I think their contribution towards peace, not just within our community, but internationally, I think it's been exemplary. And, you know, I feel that's something I must say. Now, the other two gentlemen were with us here are Tommy Kirkham, who comes from a loyalist paramilitary background, and bringing up the rear is a chap, Gerry Smith, who was a paramilitarist within republicanism. And as you can see, we've advanced so much now that they're quite glad to sit beside each other. And the only problem we had outside, we were talking about football, as men invariably do. And we discovered, and I don't want to slag them too much, but my team is Manchester United, and these other two guys, and it's just funny how it's turned out. Their two football teams came second and third in the Premier League. Great Irish rugby player and a chairman of the Peace Players, and this man steps out also and uses sport in not a protagonist way, but he uses sport as something that we can all have. He represents the Peace Players, which is an organisation which internationally gets communities playing sport together and learning to respect each other. So that's a marvellous tool, and no better man for sort of carrying that out. I think the choice of Belfast, 15 years into since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, is profound. I think it's a time. Even at 2 or 3 o'clock this morning, we had a reminder from some guys who still have not signed up for peace, because it's all about patience. You know, we're dealing with hundreds of years of ethnic difference here. We have a problem in how we define ourselves, whether that be Irish, British, Northern Irish, or whatever. You know, we have a city of the city of culture, Londonderry, Gerry. A bit convoluted, but I would prefer to be convoluted and respect difference. We may in time find a way of truly sort of joining up as people, because we are very joined up. We are the same people. We all suffered the same through these troubles, but out of that suffering, I think, has come a great determination for us all to move on. And I honestly do believe that the politicians, we have to be patient with them, because it's easy for us to snipe from the sidelines, but they are still dealing with these differences. And I think time, patience, and more magnanimity will deal with all of that. And I think, you know, now having moved from those dark days of balance, we now have a fledgling Stormont, whereby the people there from all our different ethnic backgrounds are represented. Now, it may not, and I'm sure Patricia McKeown in particular may not agree with me in saying that even the recession, I had an old teacher who said that even around every negative there's a positive, and vice versa. And I think because of the recession, I think the politicians have been forced more together in dealing with sort of bread and butter issues, as opposed to retreating to the respective camps and maybe chasing the old mantra. We are very much a part of Europe now, and I think the Europeanization of this situation has liberated us in many ways in our political thinking. And instead of sort of trying to pursue things that seem to separate us, I do believe in accentuating and developing those things that bring us together. Now, I think with that in mind, I'm conscious that we're a bit tight on time. So I think, from what I understand, Bronagh, Hinds, you were okay. So Tommy Kirkham will come forward first, and he will share in about 10 minutes his experiences.
Thanks, Gerry. Good morning, everyone. As Gerry said, my name is Tommy Kirkham. I was a former Loyalist political prisoner and spokesperson for the Ulster Political Research Group. And I've been a political representative for over 20 years as a member of the Democratic Unionist Party, and much later the Ulster Democratic Party. My elected political career finished with me as an independent member of Newton Borough Council. Today I want to speak about Northern Ireland and my part in the conflict, which we in this province of Ulster call the Troubles. At 15 years of age, I got involved in the conflict. A conflict, I may add, that I didn't create. It was created for me. It was all around me, on the streets, in school, on the news, in the house, in the local shops, through family members and friends. For me, it was unavoidable. At 16 years of age, I was in prison, but I wasn't coerced by someone in charge or ordered to do so. I was an active and willing participant in the conflict. I believed that my country was in danger, and despite all the speeches and the promises, the bombs kept going off and the people kept getting killed. I am certainly no political radical or guerrilla fighter, just an ordinary Protestant who decided to take a stand. On my release from prison, I wanted to ensure that 15 and 16-year-olds knew the reasons behind the conflict, and more importantly, the historical background as to who we were and why there was a conflict at all. In 1984, my personal circumstances changed, and I found myself out of work due to a serious car accident on the way back from a parliamentary meeting. I was left with no job, no qualifications, and no experience. I was then offered a job in Farset Youth and Community Project, which was a cross-community action for community employment scheme in West Belfast. At Farset, I was introduced to a wide range of people, including ex-political prisoners from both sides. I had no fear of either fighting my corner or debating it, whichever came first. But the important change came for me when I was introduced to the concept of transformation through community development. I have now been involved in community work for over 30 years, in both paid and unpaid positions. I took part in the talks process up until the Good Friday Agreement and voted yes, only on the basis that there was to be a release of prisoners. How could I be true to myself and have a loyalist prisoner serve one more day if I had the power to help the decision which is going to lead to the release of prisoners? Everything else, in my view, was secondary and could be fixed if it was broken or damaged in any way. So what changed for me? There was nothing dramatic happened except for the attempts to manipulate the thinking of the organisation I belonged to at that time and some of the people involved. There was also an expectation within the unionist community that things would be fine and our community would thrive in the peace process. Again, despite the promises, we still live in poor housing conditions, we still live in disadvantaged areas, antisocial behaviour and crime is still on the increase, and the funding of some groups and not others within my community has led to disengagement. Anyone who speaks out is a troublemaker and anti-peace process. In the past week, we have seen the cowardly murder of a British soldier on the streets of London, and we have learned, or at least had an insight, into the security services and the shady world of making decisions that can damage individuals, families or whole communities for a long time. Although we have had our own government here in Northern Ireland on a number of occasions, we have also had direct rule and a number of cobbled together systems in between. Still, the point I want to make is that during all these systems of government, even when the politicians thought they were in control and kept telling us they were and are, there was always another player. The intelligence services who had a hand in all our affairs and yet are accountable to no one. The current situation on the eve of the marching season is very volatile and open to manipulation. I only hope that common sense will prevail and we can continue with our work in progress. I want to leave something with you, because no matter what the conflict has been in Northern Ireland, should it be on a sectarian basis or should it be an internecine feud within loyalism, at the end of those conflicts everyone sat around the table. My view has always been, certainly in the last 15 years, to get to the table first. Let's stop where we are, get to the table first and get the negotiations open before anyone else is gathered. So I'm going to leave that with you, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Tommy, for sharing there. That's the sort of stuff that we want to hear, because sometimes, you feel when you're coming out of conflict, every time we do something like this, I notice a very, very encouraging change. And I can't emphasise enough, I think we're dealing with hundreds of years of conflict here on this island, and the way we will resolve it is obviously going to take a lot of time and patience. But it's so encouraging that every time I listen to people who come from paramilitary backgrounds, what they're saying is changing, and I so welcome that. Gary Smith, who came from the Republican side of things, I would invite Gary up now to have a sharing.
Good afternoon. I'm not a member of any political party. I'm a member of a political representative, and currently I'm working in a Workers' Education Association in community education across Northern Ireland. I was born in 1959 in Belfast, so I grew up through the 1960s and the 1970s in an area of West Belfast called Andersonstown, and then after in North Belfast in the Limestone Road area. So, without going into too much detail about the background of what happened in Ireland, Northern Ireland, whatever you want to call it, there were those two clear divisions between what we perceived to be unionism, loyalism, and the British, and on the other side, Irish, Catholic, nationalist. Growing up, there was a realisation that there was a difference in the way people were treated. We had things here in the 1960s called the company vote, which meant that people could have 6, 7 votes, just depending on how many houses they owned. That there was gerrymandering of boundaries where you could have, for example, a 70% Catholic majority somewhere, but elect 2, maybe 3 unionists to every 1 nationalist. So there was a lot of things wrong. There were a lot of things wrong in terms of employment, etc. And that led to a rise and a movement to bring about civil rights, and which in turn, through probably mismanagement by the forces to be, that broke down and led into a period of conflict from 1969, 1970 onwards. I first became involved with the Republican movement when I was 14, the junior when the IRA, which was known as Nobel Peace Laureates. And really, the idea of being a Republican from a background like ours, although you look at the state, you look at the Unionists, you look at the British government, you look at the Queen, you look at all these other forces that were out there, and they all represent the same thing, the maintenance of the Union and the maintenance of the life of Britain. We saw ourselves as very much alone, hence the name of the political party, which is allied to the Republican movement, which is Sinn Féin, which means ourselves alone. And to be on your own and to have that idea, that was fine, because for Republicans, for hundreds of years, it was always being on your own, being separate, and trying to bring about something that was sometimes impossible, but you carried on that sort of fight. So really, when I was younger, I had not a sort of a very politicised view of what had to happen or what was happening around me, but very much a sense of this is where I belonged and that's what I was. As I got older, I went into the IRA proper, and when I was 18, I went to prison. It was 1978. I was in prison until the end of 1989. When I came out in 1989, I was 30 years old. While I was in prison, a lot of things happened. I was there during the period of hunger strikes, etc., which was a very emotional time. And in that experience, you're coming across people who are so committed, absolutely so driven by their sense of being right, that you're swept along by that. And it's very, very hard to see any other way. It's very, very hard to sort of break away from that and say, you know, maybe I think this, maybe I think that. But around about the period in the mid-1980s, there began to be a bit of a change took place in the prison, where a lot of the prisoners were saying we need to move into something different. And a lot of those ideas were coming from outside. And there was a movement then towards looking politically at who we were, looking at how we could maybe move ahead. There was then the process of Republicans actually starting to go into council, starting to look at ways in which they could make things different. That led into the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s when I first came out of prison. And at that time there was a lot of talk about going to be ceasefire. The ceasefires, as you know, happened here in 1993, and the process of the political process started to move forward. I have to say that from the mid-1980s we were very much a supporter of that. I think that we've reached the point where, and sometimes this can happen in other places, I think you look at other conflicts and other situations around the world, ours was very much a contained process. And Tommy alluded to the state forces and the way in which they actually contained the process here, the way in which they actually contained the conflict. I think there was one time where people talked about sustainable and acceptable levels of balance, and I think that's what happened. The conflict was allowed to happen, it was maintained here, but it was kept at a level. So when I came out of prison, while I was in prison, I actually studied. I got my first degree. I came out and I actually started working on projects in the community, working with young people who were getting into trouble with the law, getting themselves into the joyride and the theft or whatever. And what I actually found then was working with kids from both sides of the interface, kids from Shankill and West Belfast. And they were falling foul of the police, they were falling foul of the state, they were falling foul of the paramilitaries in the old areas, they were falling foul of the IRA, the UDA, the UDF, whatever. So they were actually a little group who didn't have any allegiance to anybody except themselves. And they didn't really have any political agendas, or they didn't have a view on how we should deal with things. And they were coming from very, very much a simplistic way of viewing the world. And I think that there was a bit of an insight into that, because I actually got the view that if you can let go of a lot of the baggage that you carry with you, you can actually start to see other people's ways of viewing the world. You may not always agree with it, but you can actually start to see that. I've been fortunate that I've met a lot of people from other areas where there have been conflict. In fact, a few years ago, I went to a thing in Paris with a group which was dealing with dissidents, people who left Iran after the Shah and once the clerical regime, the Ayatollah, came to power. I was talking to people who had been in a place called Grehan prison, and a lot of the things that happened there was absolutely horrendous. And compared to the conflict here, I actually began to realize a lot of things around the world, things that were happening with people around the world, were much worse. People were much more affected than we had here. But I think when you're in a conflict or in a conflict situation, you only really see your own little patch. You only really see what affects you. So over the years then, in working in community education, I left the project I was on for 4 years, went back to Queen University and I did a master's degree. When I came out of that, I ended up working in the Ulster People's College with Bronagh. Stayed in the Ulster People's College for a few years. I went then to the Upper Springfield Development Trust, and I was the youth programme manager there. And the guy who was my assistant, right towards the very end of the conflict in 1997, Went out one Friday evening while I left work. He used to go and do a doorman on the Space nightclub, and that night he was shot dead by a fellow called Terry. He was my workmate. And I remember thinking at that time, what a horrible bloody waste. What an absolute horrible and horrendous waste. And I think that there were a lot of things happening really from events at the end of the 1980s through the 1990s. The Gibraltar incident, the incident with the corporals in Andersonstown, things that happened to Terry and other people at that time, that just took the idea that there's no point in carrying on doing this because it's only self-sustaining, it's got no purpose, it does no good. It's only about killing people because you want revenge, you want to sort of prove that you're right and they're wrong. How do we move things forward? I think we've come to a point now where, and I've come to a point in my life where I realise that it's much, much more important that we deal with things around equality and justice. I work on a project called Man Matters, and I see I'm in front of hundreds of women here, but I work on a project that's actually about trying to encourage a community involvement and trying to encourage investment in the issues working around men. I don't know if you're aware, but in Northern Ireland, men die 5 years earlier than women. They're 4 times more likely to take their own life. We're actually twice as likely to take our own life as we are as men in England. There are also a lot of situations around twice as many men are in mental institutions, etc. So in terms of dealing with issues here, we've got a situation in Northern Ireland where men don't talk, they don't share their thoughts and their feelings. I think there's a lot of legs that actually come around conflict from that. So that's one of the issues that I work on the project. But I also feel that if we're going to move forward, it has to be something which includes everybody. And I think we have to encourage people to come together more. We have to have kids come together more in education. We have to have joint community projects. We particularly have to get men talking together. Women have been doing it for years and are very, very good. I think that when you look at the women's sector, one of the things that the women's sector has done is brought people together. We need to do that with men as well. Into the future, keep building, keep working, learn from other places and learn from other people who have done, and where we can, encourage other people to do the same. Where I am now and where I was 35 years ago. 35 years ago was all very simple for me. And I was only a young man at the time. Very, very simple, very, very easy decisions to make. Looking into the future, let's move forward. One thing I will say is that if we're all going to let go of things, we're going to let go of the past, I think we also have to, and there's a situation here, for example, myself and Tommy, we're not allowed to adopt a child. We're not allowed to have house insurance, or maybe one or two companies that give us house insurance. This is 18, 20 years after the peace process. Not allowed in the United States of America. My car insurance, I'm only allowed to be insured through 2 companies. I'm not allowed to be a representative for a political party in Stormont. I think as we move forward, it's not just the paramilitaries and former paramilitaries have to let go. I think everybody has to realise, as Tommy said, this wasn't our conflict, we didn't make it, we inherited it. So we're going to move forward, we'll move forward together, and we all recognise each other's work today. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gerry. That was great, and right on time too. We now move on to Patricia McKeown, leading member from the trade union movement, and I'm sure she's some interesting things to say.
Thank you, Gerry. I want to thank you, sisters, compañeros, for this wonderful invitation. Since I've been here this morning, I have had the absolute pleasure of re-establishing contact with a woman I haven't seen for 29 years, Rebecca Johnson from Grehan Common. Not only were we in Grehan Common in 1984, but Rebecca was invited by the women of the trade union movement in Ireland to come to our town and to speak about non-violence in 1984. I haven't yet said hello, but I'm reunited with Rigoberta Menchú, who was here 30 years ago as the guest of women in the Irish trade union movement, because as well as trying to work for some peace and justice in our own society, we have always reached out across the planet where we can and struggled where we can. And of course, we have 2 women Nobel Laureates for peace. In this tiny little place, we've got 2, Mairead and Betty, and that must say something about the role of women. And I do want to talk about the role of women. But before then, this is the 15th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, our international peace treaty. A long time ago, we were advocating that our people would support the agreement, vote yes in a referendum. Nobody liked all of it, but it was the best chance for peace, and it had some really important promises. And for women in particular, it promised equality of opportunity, it promised human rights, and for this damaged society, it promised a process for dealing with the past so that we could heal and have hope for the future. That was 15 years ago. So there are children born at that point who did not experience our conflict, who are 15 years old today, and for whom those promises have not been fulfilled, and for whom there is not a great deal of hope. And that is something we've all got to be very concerned about. As I stand here today, life expectancy for the most disadvantaged groups in our society here has dropped since that peace agreement was signed. Premature death for the poorest people in our society has risen since we got our own new government 12 years ago. And there are people in our society dying in a peace process from a preventable disease, a disease called inequality. And that is unacceptable. That is something I'm not prepared to tolerate. It's something my movement isn't prepared to tolerate. And I know it's something that women in particular in this society are not prepared to tolerate. The title of this session was How You Build a Shared Future. And I have a fairly straightforward answer in the negative, unfortunately. You don't do it by ignoring equality and human rights, unless you pay real attention to eliminating discrimination, to trying to make a fair and just society, to ensuring that fundamental human rights are at the heart of the agenda, then you share nothing. Small groups of people might share the resources, they might divide them out between each other. The political process might look like it's fairer because it divides the resources, but the people on the edge of the precipice, the most disadvantaged in our society, will go over that cliff unless there's a genuine commitment to equality and human rights. And it is a sad fact of life that in the majority of peace processes on this planet, the biggest losers have been the poor as a generic group and women as the single biggest group. And we're highly conscious of that, not only in the world we live in, but further afield. In this society, women, like the rest of the planet, 51%, the majority, have been the mothers, they've been the workers, the providers. In numbers too small, they have been the trade union leaders. My union is unique in this part of the world. It has been led by women for 40 years. You won't find that in many other places. Women as community leaders. Strongly throughout the conflict, women rose as community leaders. I'm watching their replacement by men. I'm watching women-only groups being told they have to employ men. You know that thing in a society, whether it's your big official world war or it's your own local conflict, when the rules are relaxed to allow women to do things they wouldn't traditionally be allowed to do? Well, it looks like we're reversing again. Women's place in this society is not leading their communities, not leading their unions, not leading in politics. We have very few women elected inside our political system. Why should that be? Women were combatants. Some of them dead, many of them still alive. Where are they and what have they got to say? So there's a great deal of work to be done, given that all of the big campaigns during the conflict and after it, the prison campaigns, the rights campaigns, the search for a Bill of Rights, the search for equality, have been predominantly led by women, then why have we not got to where we should be? And why do these days we talk about a thing called a women's sector, when I started out life in a women's movement? And I think that's a very significant difference. One of the things that is happening in our society here is that we are being controlled by how the resources are delivered. And in order to get the resources, you have to be set up in a certain way to conform with certain criteria and certain rules. And quite a lot of that is about expunging the revolution that I expect to hear and see from women. So we get reduced to a sector instead of a movement, instead of 51% of the planet. We have a long way to go. Some things have changed for the good, but I make no apologies for saying that we are profoundly disappointed 15 years on that the promises made have not been delivered. Because who said that the world we want to live in is not just one that's about the absence of violence, and that peace is not the absence of violence, it's the presence of justice. And the presence of justice is something we still seek in this society. But one of the things I was saying about the women of this society, they don't give up. They're not giving up. There are a number of them in this room today who are determined, including my sister, who's going to speak directly after me, determined that we can change. We know we can. I mean, we look at Mairead and we know that these things are possible. We look at Mairead and we know the other truth, that women in this society do genuinely reach out to women in other societies. And isn't it remarkable, in the search for peace and justice, that some wars or conflicts are considered more acceptable than others? So there's Mairead working with people like me on the unacceptable issues in our society, like Palestine. How many UN resolutions need to be passed before the powers on the planet say you're wrong? What do you have to do in order to tackle apartheid in that country when you've already got all the mechanisms and you eradicated it in another? And of course, Mairead's just come back with the truth we don't see on our TV screens in terms of what's actually happening in Syria. And that's a hard call to make. That's an unpopular story to put out there in the middle of a surrogate war. More acceptable, but equally horrendous, is the kind of work we're trying to do on Colombia. We now have a cross-party, cross-trade union movement, little peace initiative between Northern Ireland and Colombia. And that peace initiative has borne witness to what is effectively a society where capitalism is completely out of control, has no restrictions whatsoever, and the consequence of that is death, extrajudicial murder, disappearances, displacement, wrongful imprisonment, torture, all of those things happening in a society which has equality and human rights written into its constitution, and where the European Union is just in the process of signing a free trade agreement with them, as they have done with Israel, and that free trade agreement is supposed to be conditional on the presence of equality and human rights, and where the US has just completed the free trade agreement with them. There was supposed to be a labour plan. There is no labour plan. It is still the most dangerous place on the planet for trade unionists, and as I speak, they'll have killed another one. So there are unpopular causes, and then there are popular causes, and I do pay tribute to the women peace activists like Mairead who are prepared to stand up and say, in this world of ours, this is not acceptable, whether you like it in the US or the UK or not. And I want to finish on a note here. Women in their thousands will be out in the streets again in the city of Belfast come the 15th of June, because by that stage the boys with the guns and the weapons of mass destruction will have arrived here. G8 is coming, and the people of Northern Ireland, I hope the people of the entire island of Ireland, I hope people of further afield than that, will be descending on our little town and will be making their voices clear on the kind of issues I have heard today, particularly from all the laureates this morning, and saying that this is a profoundly unfair world, but it's totally capable of being changed. And, as George Mitchell said about our peace process, it will be ordinary men and women who will make small steps every day to ensure that this world we live in changes for the better, and that's what we intend to do. And anybody who would like to come back, visit, join us, bring your banner. The march, the big march, is on the morning of the 15th of June. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patricia. As expected, it was first-class sharing. Bronagh will now join us and let us have her thoughts.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I don't know whether an academic institution would claim me. I see myself rather as an activist, but I have been through some. Just to put it a little in context, the conflict in Northern Ireland is primarily a territorial dispute, not a religious war. And it's about whether Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom or part of Ireland. The majority favour a United Kingdom, while the minority favour being reunited with the rest of Ireland. The different territorial allegiances are reflected in religious and cultural differences. Sometimes people mix it up and think it is a religious war. However, the difference in numbers between majority and minority is not very great. And actually, if you draw a line from the top to the bottom of Northern Ireland, the majority and minority switch. Okay? When you take your tour and go through Belfast or elsewhere, you will see enormous peace walls around. And when I had the privilege of working with the Irish government on a cross-learning project involving Ireland, Northern Ireland, Timor-Leste and Liberia, the women came first here, expecting to learn from us, not that we were expecting to kind of teach people, expecting to learn, and wondered amazingly that there was even any peace here, because these walls still exist, more than 80 of them between communities. And while we are grappling with that, within the context of that, what is not being dealt with is what Patricia referred to, is actually the social and the economic divide in this society, which is very great. The other thing that I think we need to take note of in terms of where we are in this peace process. Yes, we are 15 years on. The agreement was signed in 1998, and I was part of those that negotiated it, as we had women organised to actually have women's voices in those peace talks, and Northern Ireland was the first example of that, and a good example of the lack of follow-through and what still remains to be done and achieved for women. Women have not had what was promised in that agreement, as Patricia has said. But I think it's important to note that patience is required in a peace process. A mark of the progress in ours happened in 2011, when actually the Northern Ireland Executive, which is the government of Northern Ireland, completed its first term of office. It actually never completed another term in the first many years of the peace process because of issues of disagreement and further agreement that had to be made, decommissioning of weapons that had to happen. So, importance of patience. It is important. I think we have to recognise that we have a successful peace process up to a point. So we can say, I was asked last night whether or not if it stopped, we were stuck or we were going back. I think I would lay my view on the line that I think we are stuck at this point for a number of reasons. So patience is important, but actually, very clearly, and it has been acknowledged by governments, that civil society has had an important role in parallel to the political process, nudging it, encouraging it, pushing it, challenging it, trying to step further within it. And one of the things that we are challenged with currently is that we don't have as much civic leadership and civil society organisation as we did have over the years. Partly that is, as Patricia has referred to, a funding issue, but partly it is that when people speak out in issues that need to be spoken out in, they are accused of actually destabilising the peace process, whereas the intention is, because the political leaders are comfortable at the stage at which the peace process is at, and in fact we need to give our civic leadership back the confidence to speak out, to be risky, to push us further in terms of what we need to do. So, the depth and range of peace building only begins in transition. It is interesting. I mean, we could tell you of many projects where women started, all the first counselling and trauma before anybody in the statutory side was interested in funding that. We could talk about women working together, as Gerry has done, bringing women together across the divide in common projects before anyone else was doing it. We could talk about women mobilising together right across the political divide to organise for the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition to elect women into the multi-party negotiations so that women could have their voices there. But at this point, for example, if women had not been in those peace talks, some of what they call the soft issues would not have been there. You know, the soft issues, which are actually the hard issues in terms of peace building. You know, dealing with exclusion and alienation, the marginalisation that Patricia was talking about, community cohesion and sharing, shared education, tackling sectarianism, tackling the very divided living societies that we have with divisions between communities. And actually, if it hadn't been for women, actually, if it hadn't been for women, there would have been no reference to victims in a peace agreement. Can you imagine that? Not a single reference to victims, not a reference to community development, no references to women mentioned in the agreement. So I think that was extremely important. But those are the hard issues of peace building after the negotiation of settlement. Often when elite politicians have lost interest because their particular immediate demands have been met, i.e. they're in power. So, for example, we came to an arrangement which I think is important. They are in and they are sharing power. But we can actually see through the thin veil of how power sharing is being managed. We have two parties in lead who actually are operating as political trading blocs and negotiating gains off across against one another. Now, some of us who actually have fought and been marching from the 60s and 70s. I know we don't look that old, or tell us we don't look that old. In the 60s and 70s, for civil rights, did not trade off domination, by one majority community for domination shared by two communities who operate as trading blocks about what they're going to give to particular people in their community. What we need to do is to grow a society recognizing that we have gone so far on a reasonably successful peace process, but in order that everyone benefits from the dividend, we have to build it on a common understanding and a common agreement to international standards of equality and human rights. And any addressing of building sharing across the communities should not be a trade-off on the equality and human rights agenda, but needs to be done within the context of equality and human rights. So what we are facing in the community now, if I can name it, is a failure of leadership. I've talked about the political trading blocks. They share power, but not with anyone else yet. For example, the primary issue that the Women's Coalition had written into the peace agreement was a civic forum to accompany the political forum of the Assembly and to assist a civic engagement in an ongoing way with building peace at some kind of influential decision-making level. The political authorities destabilised that, and it currently no longer exists. Now, there may be discussions about how to reconstitute it, but it does not exist at the moment. In terms of building a shared future, for example, the political leaders were driven to it because they want an economic benefit, a particular piece of economic legislation from the British government, and they were prompted to make some movements on a shared future agenda in order to perhaps be given some sweeties on this economic agenda. In fact, our leadership needs to address much more seriously building a shared future on a basis of equality, rights and justice throughout this whole community. So my message is this as I'm coming to the end of my time. Let's look at the role that women have played. I've spoken about the Women's Coalition. I've spoken about women, including women ex-prisoners, who first built the counselling and the prisoners groups. Let's look at two other examples. In our reform of policing, which has been reasonably successful, women have grown in greater numbers. But also, when that was being managed in terms of its integration into the community and in community policing, and my colleague Debbie Donnelly is sitting at the back, who was leading in this in the Northern Ireland Policing Board, women formed 50% of the district policing partnerships before political parties all agreed to sign up to them. And when political parties got to sign up to them, women were marginalised because those political parties did not nominate equal numbers of women with men onto those bodies. We've had and have continuing issues around tensions between communities and around parading through particular areas that raises policing challenges. And that has broken out into conflict. Only the other week, a big dialogue between all the parties, including the police, the paramilitary groups, political parties, were all flown over to Cardiff for a dialogue. 2 women among 33 representatives. It is simply appalling, and it will not do. Now, I know Judy is not keen on the UN, but in some senses, it is important that we work at multiple levels, that we work within our community, and that we work in connection, as we have done, as Patricia said, with women across in the Middle East and in Latin America, in elsewhere, in terms of sharing our experiences, learning from one another, and that we work at our regional level. For us, it's within the European Union, and at the international UN level. Now, we know about UN Security Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and it's taken multiple resolutions to try and reinforce it and to get indicators against which to measure progress. And it would be very easy for governments to pay lip service and actually to deliver some, even though they're not doing enough, on tackling issues around preventing violence against women and protecting women and girls in terms of violence. But what they are not doing, either at international, regional or national level, either in countries in conflict or in those countries that intervene in those conflicts, are putting equal numbers of women into either decision-making and negotiations, into conflict resolution, into missions which go to countries, into the hierarchies. And also, in terms of addressing issues about gender-based violence, they are not mainstreaming that issue of women's participation and representation and empowering women as agents of change in their own destinies on those issues, as opposed to treating women as victims and beneficiaries. So my pet issue is that we have to put women's rights, not just gender equality, and not just talking about gender, and Gerry is right, because we have to talk about the gender relations between women and men on these issues. But we must lead our campaigns as a women's movement within the context of women's rights, and look for women's empowerment and women's agency from the top to the bottom. Thank you very much.